So when we talk about Marx, it's all about class conflict, struggle between the classes, and as a result of that, inequality in society. Now, I want you to think about the size of each of these social classes. How many really, really, really super wealthy people are there compared to how many poor working class employees there are? Now, the working class employees will far outnumber the higher class owners. There's simply more of them. And Marx believed that at some point, again, keep a picture in your head of a volcano rumbling, getting ready to go off. He truly believed that at some point, all these workers would become aware of being in the same social class. They would become aware of just how badly they're exploited by the wealthy class. And eventually, they were going to do something about it. Now, he absolutely did not think that people who were part of the working class were not intelligent. Not at all. He did not think that they were stupid and therefore they were unaware of what their position was. And he didn't think that the lower class was fooled by the upper class. However, Marx did not think that they realized just how exploited they were. They didn't recognize the extent to which they were being taken advantage of. It's kind of like if you have a friend who's in a bad relationship and on the outside, you can see just how bad it is and you encourage them to break up with that person, but they don't because they just don't see it. And according to Marx, eventually the working class would realize this. And he said they would develop a class consciousness. Their consciousness of the reality of the social class that they belong to would evolve. And once this occurred, they would be more likely to try to do something about it. They'd be more likely to try to advocate for themselves. How would this happen? Well, they would develop trade unions that would advocate for their rights, for example, for better working conditions or better wages or better benefits. And again, Marx said all of this would build and build and build and build until some kind of revolution would occur. And when that happened, instead of having a society with a small number of really wealthy owners who benefit from being the owners, this whole concept of people owning private property and all of this would be abandoned, and then there would simply be no class system at all. So let me restate that so it's simple. So Marx thought that eventually all of the working class, who are the majority and were the majority then, they're usually very submissive. They might not be happy with the system, but they let the system continue. He said eventually all of those people were going to rise up, they'd revolt, the volcano would go off, and we'd end up with a peaceful, classless society in which everyone was equal. Very, very kind of optimistic theory in one way, because we're supposed to end up with peace and no inequality. But in reality, it doesn't work out that way. Now, we do have some countries in the world that are based on this communist system that Marx predicted. China, Cuba, North Korea, Laos, Vietnam, Russia was for a while. But for the most part, what Marx predicted would be great in theory, but it doesn't work well in real life. Why? Because people are, I'm going to make a really stupid statement. People are human beings, and human nature gets in the way. So again, conflict theory, Marxism, Marxist theory, it's all the same thing. So this is where one of his most famous quotes comes from. Workers of the world unite. You have nothing to lose but your chains. And that's what he was saying. If you all come together and you all revolt together, you are so strong, you would be able to overthrow the entire system. But as we know, that never happened. Now, another conflict theorist is Max Weber. So, for whatever reason, Weber is pronounced Weber, probably because he's German. He's also a sociologist, and he lived at a slightly later point than Karl Marx. So, Weber was born in 1864. And just to give you kind of the context for this means he did most of his work about 20 to 30 years after Marx had died. So he's viewed as one of the three founders of sociology, along with Marx and Durkheim. And Weber is a conflict theorist, but again, doing the majority of his work about 20 to 30 years after Marx. He actually had some criticisms of him. He pointed out some flaws in Marx's conflict theory. Now, having said this, however, he did exist at a later point in history. So while Weber can pick at Marx's work, and we can pick at Marx's work, we have the benefit of hindsight to help us see the flaws in it, while he was simply writing about what he thought would happen without a crystal ball. So in any case, we have Marx, who pretty much stayed focused on this ideal of social stratification, these really distinct social classes. You got the owning class and the working class. Weber, unlike Marx, predicted that there would be a lot of growth in between the upper and the lower class. So Marx was pretty stuck in this idea of lower class and upper class. He didn't even really talk about the middle class very much. Weber did. He said you're going to have a lot of increments in between each of the classes. So it's not just lower, middle, upper class. He said you're going to have a lot of classes in between, so that there would be less distinction. There wouldn't just be these two extremes. So for example, he said there would be a lot of growth in the service industry and the middle class. Well, what do I mean about the service industry? Specifically, this refers to anybody who does not do manual labor. So if you think of workers who are not part of the stereotypical lower working class, doing all the grudge work in factories, but at the same time, they're still not wealthy, they're not owners. So in other words, Weber recognized the development of workers who are professionals or managers, the expansion of the middle class. Weber recognized that unlike the poor lower working class, the middle class and the service class, these are people who would have a higher economic status. They're not rich, but they certainly have a higher status economically and socially. So in other words, with the development of these in-between classes, life is not going to be as difficult for them as the lower class. It's not going to be as hard for them. They're not going to have these 12-hour days. They wouldn't be working in horrible factories with no ventilation and no benefits and time off. Now, they might not be owners. They might not be super wealthy, but they are definitely better off than the lower working class. And he viewed this as a flaw in Marx's conflict theory. I'm a little bit more understanding of Marx because I like the guy. I would call it an oversight. Weber calls it a flaw. The fact that Marx simply didn't predict that the social classes would evolve the way they did. I think a general way of summarizing Weber's observations of the social class hierarchy is that he felt it was not as clear-cut as Marx did. It wasn't as extreme as Marx said. Weber felt, that social class struggle and even just social class divisions were not as simple as Marx said they would. So in other words, Weber said there's going to be a lot more rungs on the ladder than Marx thought. And he also disagreed with a complete, total emphasis on economics. He didn't disagree that economics were crucially important, but he did disagree that so much emphasis should be put on class conflict, excluding other influences like politics, like religion. So Weber didn't disagree with Marx on the whole regarding conflict theory, but when it came to the finer details, he took a broader approach. He wasn't so narrow minded. So, I hope you're understanding everything so far. I hope it's making sense. If you want to pause this and go back and re listen to something, no big whoops. Certainly do that. It's better to make sure you have a clear understanding of what we've discussed so far before we go on than to watch or listen to the whole lecture and then just be lost. So, in fact, in my notes, I have it that this is where we'd take a break if we were in class. Now, we're going to jump ahead in time quite a bit now. And I mean really jump ahead in time, way up to the 1960s and 70s. So quite a leap. Still talking about inequality and how everybody does not experience society in the same way. Early conflict theory, remember with Marx, focused on economics, property ownership, wealth, that sort of thing. Those are what the upper ruling class used to control society. That's what they used to dominate society and to maintain their position. And by maintaining their own position, they keep the lower class in the lower class. Weber, a few decades later, put a little bit of his own spin on it, saying it's not just economics. And as time went on and history progressed, increasingly, conflict theorists began to take other things into consideration. All conflict theorists. Just as Weber suggested, thinking about how they too can cause social and economic inequality or maintain social and economic inequality in society, thinking about how other things should be taken into consideration. And these might include things that most people would never recommend as contributing to economic inequality, like language, music, advertising, even just ideas or language. You might be thinking, how the heck did those contribute to to inequality in society? Well, let's take a look at this. Antonio Gramsci, this is how you pronounce his name, Gramsci, another guy with awesome hair. He was Italian and he was a Marxist, which means, generally speaking, he would look at society and recognize that there were different social classes and different economic classes. He agreed with basic Marxism that there's an upper class, which is also referred to as the ruling class. And he agreed that this minority of society maintained control and dominance over the majority, that they maintain their higher position by controlling the economic sector. So Gramsci agreed with all of that. But he added to this because he said that the upper ruling class also maintained their dominance in much, much more subtle ways, in less noticeable ways than just straightforward economics. So Gramsci is mainly remembered for his idea of cultural hegemony. This is not as difficult or hard to understand as it sounds. This means that a society's culture is also controlled in many ways by the upper ruling class, just like the economic sector is. That the ruling upper class and other dominant groups control the dominant culture of a society. And by doing this, they transmit their own values as the accepted values of society. And if this sounds odd to you, if it's a little bit difficult for you to understand at the start, don't worry. I'm going to explain it in a few different ways, and I'm going to give you some examples as well. So what Gramsci was saying, that even in a culturally diverse society like Canada right now, that the upper ruling class control the culture of society. They manipulate the culture of society so that their own worldview becomes the accepted cultural norm in society for everybody, no matter what your class is. So, for example, education. Oh, did I go ahead too quick? Yes, I did. Okay. So he meant that the ability of the upper ruling class to hold power over social institutions is something that happens in our society. And by controlling the social institutions in our society, the upper ruling class influence the values that we have, the norms that we have, even just the general ideas about society and how it functions, our expectations. So when Gramsci was talking about the upper ruling class manipulating a society's culture, what he means is our general beliefs in society, kind of our general accepted perceptions about the world around us, whether our immediate environment or looking at other places in the world. So by culture, Gramsci was referring to the values of a society. Beliefs and values and perceptions about religion, for example, Gramsci would say are largely dominated and controlled by the upper ruling class. That they control our values and our perceptions and our norms when it comes to education or the legal system or the political system, or even our attitudes towards family. And I'm going to use the education system as a specific example because I know that students often have a difficult time grasping this concept of cultural hegemony. And if you can develop a really good understanding of it regarding one example, then I think all of the others will fall into place and make much more sense. So you're probably thinking, how the heck does the upper ruling class in our society affect people's perceptions and values and norms regarding the education system? How could that happen? Well, in Canada, we've all been raised to believe that in our country, we're very fortunate to have a fair, equitable education system that is equally available to everybody, regardless of their social class, their economic class, their ethnicity, their religion, their gender, and all of that. And in fact, in Canada, we've even gone so far as to make it law that everybody must attend school until a certain minimum age. Because as Canadians, we feel that a minimal level of education for all Canadians is something that we value as a country. And we want that to be a norm in our country. So in Canada, everybody has access to education. There is a standard curriculum in every province and territory that all teachers follow. So it's not that, well, you're part of this class, so we're going to teach you this, and you're part of this class, so we're going to teach you that. We have standard textbooks that all students read, and everybody is assessed in exactly the same manner. In other words, all students in Canada are on a level playing field when it comes to access to education and when it comes to access to educational opportunity. In Ontario, we even have standardized provincial testing, so that in grade 3, 6, and 10, all students are assessed in exactly the same manner with no variation whatsoever. What could be more similar and more equal than that? Well, with cultural hegemony in mind, Gramsci would look at the education system and point out that it's not a fair and equitable system in several ways. Instead, he would point out, or he would argue, that the education system actually maintains social inequality and that it legitimizes inequality. It makes it seem normal and fair. Well, how does it do this? It does this by reinforcing the ruling class ideology in education. So, it isn't poor Jennifer. She was born into a family of a lower status. She was born into a lower status family, And that really affected her ability to be successful in school. And it really affected the opportunities she had to be successful in school. We don't think she was not as successful in school because both her parents worked two minimum wage jobs each and could not provide her an enriched Montessori daycare when she was young, or a computer at home, or a tutor, or lots of books and magazine subscriptions and craft things and other things to enrich her mind. We don't think she was not as successful in school academically or socially because her family did not provide her extracurricular activities in the summer, different sports or arts related activities. Her parents didn't encourage her or allow her to go on sports teams during the school year, or put her in clubs during the school year, or get her involved in other activities at school, or take her on trips to different places. It isn't she was not as successful at school because her family moved every 18 months because of their financial problems, and her parents didn't have the time to get involved in the school's parents' council, or attend back to school night, or the Christmas concert, or parent teacher interviews. We don't say Jennifer was not as successful in school because neither one of her parents have a post secondary education. So they were less capable of providing her with assistance with homework. They were not really aware of what they should be doing to help her. And they were less able to effectively advocate for her with her teachers. And her parents were not comfortable in an educational setting because they themselves were not very not very successful at school. We don't think Jennifer wasn't very successful academically because none of the teachers at her school had a master's degree or PhD. They only had minimum qualifications and sometimes were not actually qualified teachers at all. So we don't look at the lack of opportunity and resources Jennifer had access to, and how that really had a lot to do with why she was unsuccessful in school. And as a result, while she is still part of the lower class like her parents, and that will continue with her children. Instead, the upper ruling class ideology in education reinforces to all of society that Jennifer's unsuccessful in school because she didn't try hard enough. She could have enrolled in after school activities. She could have asked her teachers for help. Her parents could have advocated on her behalf and asked the teachers and principal for help. She's unsuccessful in school because of her own performance and lack of support by her family. That is our generally accepted ruling class ideology in Canada regarding education. And this is what makes it possible for schools to maintain and legitimize existing social inequality. This is an example of what Gramsci would refer to as cultural hegemony regarding education, of these values and perceptions becoming so deeply entrenched in the great majority of society that they're accepted as just common sense and one of our core values. In other words, cultural hegemony points out that the education system as a whole perpetuates this entire ideology that helps to make inequality seem legitimate, making it seem like all students begin their education on a level playing field, that all students begin the educational race at the same starting point, when in fact they do not. And it is a fact that all students do not begin school at the same level. So cultural hegemony would point out that this ideology, supported by the ruling upper class, has simply become part of the dominant ideology of our society as a whole. That things are the way they are because they should be. It teaches everybody to accept this notion. So part of cultural hegemony states that the working class are not just being controlled economically, but ideology with ideas. And these ideas justify and normalize the position and power of the upper ruling class, ideas that normalize and justify the lower economic and social status of some people and families, sometimes for generation after generation. And in addition to the example I just gave you, is the fact that some schools have better resources than others in terms of the school building itself, in terms of playground equipment, the music room or home ec room or machine shop or lack thereof, in terms of how qualified their teachers are. So some schools have teachers with the minimum qualifications of university and teachers college. In some schools, the majority, if not all teachers, have graduate degrees. But then in others, some have never been to university. So Antonio Gramsci's concept of cultural hegemony focuses on the idea that it's much more than the ruling class's economics that control society. They also do it in less noticeable, more subtle ways, less obvious ways. So our culture is also controlled by the upper ruling class, just as the economic sector is. So let's continue. By the way, if you see the mouse moving around and you can tell I've paused it, it's because that's where I go to take a sip of tea. Now, let's keep going with Michel Foucault. Sticking with the 60s and 70s, so we're not taking a big jump again. This leads us to the idea of post-structuralism. Foucault himself was a French philosopher this time, not German French. And he focused on the relationship between power and knowledge. Okay, so we're talking about power and knowledge and how they relate. And how this was then used as a form of social control by different social institutions in society. So I want you to remember this basic idea, how power and knowledge are used to control people in society. And what Foucault did was look at how regulations, how this control is used in a society. In other words, how this kind of structural control is used. I feel like I've kind of muddled my words there, so I'm going to repeat it. So, relationship between power and knowledge, and then how that is used to control social structures in society. So economics is a form of control, according to basic conflict theory. The upper class control us economically. And because of this, they control it socially. Foucault took this a step farther and looked at how knowledge can control people. So for example, it used to be that in order to control somebody in a prison or maybe a psychiatric hospital, or even sometimes a school, force would be used. I mean, physical force. In schools, a teacher or a principal would strap a student, for example. And it's not very long ago that strapping was taken out of schools. So, relationship between power and control, and how that's used to control various social institutions in society, like the obvious ones: economics, politics, religion, education, but also in more subtle ways. Remember the concept of family, the structure of family, that is a social institution in society as well. So Foucault said that more and more often, our modern social institutions use what he called internalization of control mechanisms. And the example used in the textbook is a great one. Imagine you're in a place, in a store, that has security cameras. There's no doubt, they have security cameras. And you're thinking of taking something without paying for it. And it just so happens that the sales clerk chooses that moment to go into the back to get something. So you are alone wherever you are in the store. You think about taking it, but you don't because there are security cameras. Now, you don't know for sure you're being watched on a live feed by a guard somewhere. I'm thinking Paul Blart Mall Cop. But you might being watched. So you might be being watched by a guard somewhere in the mall. Just knowing that you might be watched, the possibility you might be being watched, makes you act as if you are being observed. This possibility controls you so you don't steal. And this is still control. This is still social control, even though nobody actually says something to you, nobody does something to you. Instead, you have an internalization of the control mechanism. So when you get confused with Foucault, think of shoplifting and security cameras and come back to this example, and it'll help keep you organized. And he said, we have this internalization of control mechanisms more and more and more in modern institutions. Driving along the highway, you see signs that say speed limit enforced by air, meaning that there will sometimes be helicopters watching how long it takes vehicles to get from one line painted on the highway to another to determine your speed. For example, it used to be that driving through Sundridge between North Bay and Toronto, there was a great big sign just before you entered the town that said, "Smile, you're on radar," because they had such a huge problem with speeding. Cars would not slow down while driving through the town. Whether there were police there or not, most people would slow down simply because of the idea of somebody being there. And this demonstrates the internalization of a control mechanism, a structure of control. Now, Foucault also said that in every social interaction that occurs, there will be a struggle for power. And I want you to think about this. I'm pretty sure that every one of you would have experience with this. So when he said that in every social interaction that occurs, there will be a structure for power, he said there will be resistance to power by the subordinate in the interaction and an attempt to exert power by the person who has more control. Have you ever had a conversation like that? So I'll use an example. If you ever met me in person or took classes with me, all my students will tell you I'm very informal, I'm very easy to talk to. However, even with that, I recognize that there is a power imbalance between interactions between myself and students, simply by virtue of the fact that I'm the professor and you're the students. So in every in every social interaction you and I would have, whether it's in person or email, whatever, there's an imbalance of power. But even if you're interacting with somebody who is on the exact same level than you, if you ever had a conversation with somebody and they always try to control the conversation, they always try to steer it back to themselves, or they always try to steer it back to putting themselves in a position where they can tell you something else about themselves. Struggle for power is a little bit more too dramatic to describe that. But there absolutely is a power struggle, isn't it? When you're trying to each assert your own will.